On the morning of February 19th, 1985, the sky over Madrid was cloudy and the air chill as passengers boarded a Boeing 727 operated by Iberia Airlines. Their destination, Bilbao, a city nestled in the north of Spain. For most of the 141 passengers, this flight would be a routine journey, an ordinary short-haul flight lasting less than an hour. However, in the cockpit, a silent storm was brewing, one that would change the course of the flight and lead to one of Spain's most tragic aviation accidents. The aircraft, a Boeing 727, was part of Iberia's large fleet. This particular model, although slightly outdated by modern standards, was still a reliable workhorse for the airline. However, it was not the aircraft's mechanical integrity that posed a threat on this fateful morning. Instead, it was the combination of poor decisions, human error, and outdated equipment that set the stage for disaster. A series of mistakes would lead the plane into the mountains of northern Spain, resulting in the deaths of all 148 people on board. The flight was piloted by Captain José Luis Patiño, a seasoned veteran with over 13,000 flight hours under his belt, including significant experience with the Boeing 727. Patiño had been with Iberia Airlines for almost 2 decades, and his colleagues described him as an excellent pilot. However, on this day, Patiño's behavior was strikingly different. His silence and inaction throughout the flight would raise serious questions in the aftermath of the crash. Sitting alongside Patiño was First Officer Emilio López Peña, a younger but experienced pilot with 5,000 hours of flying time, 2,000 of which had been spent on the Boeing 727. Although Peña had a solid flying record, he would soon make a mistake that, according to studies by NASA, had been known to be a risk for years in aviation. Behind the two pilots was flight engineer Gregorio Arobo Martin, the least experienced member of the crew, with just under 3,000 flight hours. Despite his relative inexperience, Martin was trained and qualified to manage the aircraft's systems. Still, as we will see, the complex dynamics in the cockpit would overwhelm even the most experienced crew members. At 8:40 a.m., Flight 610 pushed back from the gate at Madrid-Barajas Airport. The passengers were settled, and the pilots were completing their pre-flight checklists. The weather was typical for February in Spain, cold and foggy, but nothing unusual for pilots used to navigating through such conditions. The aircraft taxied to runway 36 left, and the first officer, López Peña, lined up the aircraft for takeoff. Patiño, as captain, monitored the systems and ensured that everything was in order. The Boeing 727's engines roared to life as the aircraft began to accelerate down the runway. The pilots had been through this routine thousands of times, and everything seemed normal. The first officer gradually pulled back on the yoke, and the aircraft lifted into the foggy sky, its wings cutting through the thick clouds. However, as soon as the plane gained some altitude, the pilots were faced with an issue. It began with a strange feeling in the aircraft, as the flight seemed to deviate from the expected flight path. Passengers in the cabin might have noticed the plane swaying or veering slightly off course. But it wasn't until the plane reached its cruising altitude of 26,000 feet that the problem began to surface. After the flight had stabilized, the cockpit atmosphere changed. Captain Patiño, who had been an active participant in the flight's early moments, became uncharacteristically silent. His behavior took on a strange tone. He stopped talking to the first officer, neglected to engage in normal communication, and began to withdraw from the operation of the aircraft. The first officer, López Peña, became increasingly concerned. Not only had Captain Patiño stopped talking, but he was also beginning to exhibit strange behavior, remaining largely passive while Peña took over many of the responsibilities in the cockpit. This sudden change in the captain's behavior would play a pivotal role in the events that unfolded during the flight. Patiño's silence and lack of involvement raised serious questions about his state of mind. Was he distracted? Was there something more serious at play? To understand this, we must also consider the fact that Captain Patiño had recently returned to active duty after a significant break. He had been reinstated after being fired due to his involvement in a pilot's strike earlier in the year. Despite being cleared to return to flying, the personal and professional tensions stemming from his treatment by Iberia Airlines could have weighed heavily on him. These factors may have contributed to his disengagement from his duties during the flight. The Boeing 727 that Iberia operated was beginning to show signs of aging. While still a reliable aircraft, it lacked some of the modern avionics and systems that newer planes had. One of the most crucial outdated systems was the altimeter. The aircraft used an altimeter that displayed altitude using a drum pointer system. This system was notorious for being difficult to read accurately, as it required the pilots to look at both a rotating drum and a fixed pointer to determine altitude. This was prone to misreading, especially in the high-stress environment of flight. Newer models of altimeters used a simpler design, with a rotating needle that made reading altitude much easier and more intuitive. On this particular flight, the pilots would encounter this issue when they began their descent towards Bilbao. At this point, the first officer, López Peña, had already requested weather information for their destination, and the flight was cleared to begin the descent. But the fog and mountains surrounding Bilbao Airport would soon make the approach more complicated. As Flight 610 began its descent toward Bilbao, the first officer, López Peña, took on the responsibility of communicating with air traffic control while also flying the aircraft. Despite his role as the primary pilot on this leg of the flight, the tension in the cockpit was palpable, with Captain Patiño continuing to remain silent. This unusual passivity from the captain seemed to take a toll on López Peña's performance. The first officer, under the added pressure of handling all the responsibilities alone, was in a situation that increasingly became more difficult. The altimeter, already prone to misinterpretation, became a point of contention as the descent began. Normally, the autopilot would adjust to the correct descent rates, and the pilots would carefully monitor the aircraft's altitude. However, Patiño seemed to lose his focus. He dialed in 10,000 feet into the altimeter window, setting the altitude for the aircraft to level off, but he did not press the altitude select button to lock this setting in. This simple yet critical action would come back to haunt them shortly. While the first officer managed the flying duties and altitude control, Patiño focused on preparing the autopilot for the next steps. The altimeter alert system, which would typically provide an early warning for any significant deviations, went unnoticed. As the aircraft began descending, the first officer, still under a great deal of stress, adjusted the plane's descent rate to 1,500 feet per minute, a steep rate given the circumstances. This decision was problematic, as the aircraft was already descending from 7,000 feet to 5,000 feet, and the rapid descent would take the aircraft dangerously close to the mountainous terrain below. The pilots, however, did not realize the magnitude of the situation. A critical communication failure occurred. The two pilots were not on the same page when it came to the aircraft's descent plan. While the altimeter was already causing confusion, the mountainous terrain surrounding Bilbao posed a greater risk. The airport itself was nestled within a valley, surrounded by tall peaks, making the approach especially dangerous in foggy conditions. The standard approach required aircraft to stay above 7,000 feet until they reached the navigation beacon that marked the initial approach point. However, with air traffic control offering a shortcut, the first officer, unfamiliar with the standard procedure, agreed to take it. The decision was influenced by personal experiences. He had flown this shortcut before, without issue, and believed it to be the best course of action. But the captain, Patiño, signaled for the crew to follow the standard approach, which would ensure the plane stayed at a safer altitude while navigating through the mountains. This conflicting approach was more than just a procedural hiccup. It was a psychological influence of Captain Patiño's desire to avoid the tension that had developed in the cockpit. López Peña had already sensed that there was something amiss with the captain's demeanor, and unsure of how to handle the situation, accepted the standard approach. Yet this move would only bring the aircraft closer to danger, compounding the confusion and disorganization in the cockpit. As the plane continued its descent, Captain Patiño remained eerily quiet. His lack of participation was unsettling, especially when the aircraft passed the 7,000-foot mark and began the critical maneuver towards the approach fix. López Peña, who was still managing all the flying duties, began to feel a sense of unease in his actions. He had been trained to rely on Captain Patiño for guidance and support, but now it seemed as if the captain had mentally disengaged from the flight. The altimeter's misreading, the decision to follow the standard approach, and the rushed descent at 1,500 feet per minute were becoming increasingly problematic. Both pilots were now far too focused on reaching the next waypoints, disregarding the surrounding terrain. As the aircraft descended below the 7,000 feet, it should have been climbing slightly, not descending at such a steep rate. But this crucial misstep went unaddressed due to the lack of communication between the pilots. Then came another overlooked signal. The altimeter alert system began sounding its audible warning when the plane passed 300 feet below the selected altitude. But at this moment, both pilots misinterpreted the sound. López Peña, believing the tone indicated that they had 900 feet left to go, did not react as quickly as he should have. The captain's silence, coupled with López Peña's misinterpretation, allowed the aircraft to continue descending below its intended altitude. As the plane reached 4,300 feet, its proximity to the towering peaks of the Pyrenees Mountains grew increasingly perilous. Just as the aircraft crossed 4,300 feet, the mountains came into full view, but not in a way the pilots expected. Hidden in the thick fog that surrounded them was an object they couldn't have predicted. A television mast that had not been listed on the approach charts. This mast, looming in the foggy abyss, would become the aircraft's worst enemy. In the fog, the mast was invisible to the pilots until the very last moment. They had no way of seeing it until it was right in front of them. The first officer, still descending the aircraft with the autopilot engaged, was not expecting such an obstruction. Even though the aircraft was descending below the selected altitude, it wasn't until they reached the mast that they realized just how grave the situation had become. With no time to react, the aircraft collided with the mast. The left wing of the Boeing 727 hit the mast, instantly tearing off the wing and sending the aircraft into an uncontrollable spiral descent. The sudden loss of the wing caused the aircraft to flip over, and before the pilots could make any attempt to regain control, the plane crashed into the valley of Mount Oiz near Bilbao, Spain. The investigation into Iberia Flight 610's crash would reveal a series of systematic failures, both technical and human. Spain's Civil Aviation Accident Investigation Commission, CIAIAC, published a detailed report that laid out the series of events that led to the tragic crash. A number of factors contributed to the disaster: pilot miscommunication and passivity. Captain Patiño's unusual silence and his lack of engagement with the rest of the crew led to confusion in the cockpit. López Peña was left to handle all of the flying duties while trying to manage radio communication with air traffic control. Outdated equipment. The altimeter system, a drum and pointer design, was prone to misreading. This led to confusion over the aircraft's altitude, which was a critical factor in the plane's descent. Human factors and mental models. The first officer, having grown accustomed to shortcuts, misjudged the approach and followed a descent path that was unnecessarily steep. This was exacerbated by Captain Patiño's mental disengagement from the flight. Lack of ground proximity warning system, GPWS. The aircraft lacked a GPWS, a safety feature that was already mandatory in U.S. aircraft. If the aircraft had been equipped with this system, the pilots would have received warnings when approaching the mountains and the mast. Mountain terrain and fog. The surrounding mountains, combined with foggy conditions, significantly reduced visibility. This, paired with the mismanagement of the descent, made the crash inevitable once the mast was hit. The Iberia Flight 610 crash prompted a series of safety reforms within the airline and the aviation industry as a whole. The crash highlighted the need for better communication and collaboration between pilots. Airlines worldwide began emphasizing CRM training to ensure that flight crews communicated more effectively, especially when dealing with high-stress situations. The outdated drum and pointer altimeters were replaced with digital and more accurate systems to prevent misreading altitudes, especially during critical phases like descent. The introduction of the GPWS in Spain, mandated after the crash, helped prevent similar accidents in the future. The system became a standard feature in aircraft to alert pilots when approaching dangerous terrain. Captain Patiño's strange behavior highlighted the need for airlines to address pilot fatigue and psychological well-being. It also brought to light the impact of personal issues on flight safety, which led to improvements in pilot training on recognizing and addressing fatigue and stress. Iberia Flight 610 was a tragic accident that could have been prevented with better communication, more effective use of technology, and improved procedures. The human error, outdated equipment, and lack of safety features all played a role in this disaster. However, the lessons learned from this accident have led to significant improvements in aviation safety. By reflecting on Iberia Flight 610, the industry as a whole has become safer. Today's aircraft are equipped with better technology, and pilots undergo more rigorous training. As a result, crashes like Flight 610 have become much rarer. But the legacy of this accident continues to shape modern aviation practices.